Hey guys, it's Coach Bearline. We're getting ready to give you your next video lesson note. Today we're going to talk about the development of U.S. government, starting with the Articles of Confederation and into the Constitution. Got a lot to cover, not a lot of time. We're going to be going through these slides pretty quick, so make sure you pause if you need to, rewind, do the things you need to make sure that you're getting the information that you need. All right, so starting out, the states, even though they were very different, did have some major similarities. Most of them had a legislative branch that made the laws, a judicial branch that was responsible for interpreting laws, and an executive branch or governor who carried out the laws. So that's something that they did have. Most states, though, chose to really limit the governor's power because they were kind of stung by the power of royal governors. In most of the states, elected legislatures had more power. Republicanism was a wide belief in American society at this time. Most wanted a political system without a monarch, one that could rule with the consent of the governed. The idea of republicanism was that property-owning citizens would be active in government. However, women, African Americans, Native Americans, and even poor whites were left out of this equation because they rarely owned property. However, the founders did view a role for women in the early republic, and this is the idea of Republican motherhood. And people believed that women had done all these things during the war. Managed farms and businesses, and fought in some cases, organized boycotts. Had been really involved in a Revolutionary War. So what developed was this idea of what's called Republican motherhood. And this is the idea that mothers should raise their children, their sons, to be patriotic future leaders, and raise their daughters to be intelligent, competent, patriotic people that could teach the next generation. So mothers were entrusted with the future of the republic in many cases. Now, some people spoke out against this, saying it was condescending. Judith Sargent Murray, for instance, was an author that believed that young women should be educated in reasoning, not just household skills. So she wanted a more equitable education for women in the new nation. And as most of you know, the first government established by the United States was the Articles of Confederation. It's an association of independent sovereign states with certain common goals. It's kind of like an agreement just to work together. It was formally adopted in 1777, so it was in effect through most of the Revolution. The powers of the new government were few. The states retained most of the power. The national government was very weak. Did have a legislative branch, which was the Continental Congress. Each state only had one vote, regardless of population, and it took 9 of the 13 states to pass a law. Now, under the Articles, the national government did have some limited powers. They could have national policies on foreign relations, so relationships with other countries, including relationship with Native American nations. They also could coin their own money and set up post offices and establish an army. They also had the power to declare war. However, 9 of the 13 states had to agree on any major laws, so it was very difficult to pass legislation. And all 13 states had to agree to amend the Articles. Most of the problems that the government faced involved money. Large war debts. They didn't have the power to collect taxes to pay those war debts, and so therefore couldn't afford an army and navy, even though they were allowed to raise one. They couldn't repay money if it borrowed from foreign governments, or from individuals, so it had trouble getting money to operate. As a result, the government had major problems with the states and other foreign and other national governments. They had very little power over the individual states, and as a result, it couldn't settle disputes because there was really no national court system between the states. With other foreign nations, the Congress was so weak it had trouble taking advantage of the territory it had gotten in the Treaty of Paris. For instance, the British never left their forts in the Great Lakes region like they had agreed to, and the British and Native Americans actually kept Americans from moving into the Northwest Territory. There's really nothing the national government could do about it. In negotiation with Spain about the use of Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans was difficult again because the national government did not have a lot of power and wasn't well respected by other countries. Also, economic problems dominated. Private citizens and businesses in every state had serious cash flow problems. New England's trade with Britain and the British West Indies was lost. Traders had to pay very high customs duties or tariffs. The southern economy was hurt because they couldn't sell cotton and other key crops to British merchants. Also, the paper money that the Congress issued wasn't backed by gold or silver. This meant that it was next to worthless, led to severe inflation. States could levy taxes, but some states required tax to be paid in gold and silver. And this is what leads to Shays' Rebellion that we talked about in class. People who didn't pay were often jailed or their property was taken. There were also major territorial disputes going this time. The Northwest Territory, which includes much of what we now call the Midwest, was unorganized. There was no way to settle it, and you still have the British kind of poking around there as well. In the West, the Articles of Confederation didn't address that at all. Western parts of Virginia, places of that nature. So states had to give up their western land claims to the central government. This is one place where the Articles did get some power. Most states gave up their lands by the early 1790s. So the national government did divide the western lands, although I want to remind you, west at this time meant between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. The West wasn't what we think of the West as west of the Mississippi. West was places like Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana and Mississippi and Alabama, places like that. So anyway, they divided territory into 10 districts. And the Land Ordinance of 1785 basically required that the land be surveyed and divided into a grid of townships 6 miles square. Each township had 36 sections of 1 square mile each. The government owned 4 of the sections, one of which would be sold to support public schools. The same regular grid was used in other territories, and it did end a lot of the boundary disputes that we saw during the period. 2 years later, the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787, which encouraged the orderly settlement of the formation of new states, all controlled by the law. It promised settlers religious freedom and other civil rights that had been denied in the past. It also did not allow slavery to expand into the Northwest Territory. Again, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, that region, and the Great Lakes region. A single governor was put in charge of the entire territory. However, a district could become its own territory if it had a population of 5,000 adult males, and then they could send a non-voting representative to Congress. A territory could write a constitution and apply for statehood once it reached a population of 60,000. So they set forth the orderly establishment of the process by which districts could become territories and territories could become states. So more or less for the entirety of the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation were the law of the land. But soon after the end of the war, the Revolutionary War, problems began to surface. We already talked about Shays' Rebellion in class. We watched a video on it, and we saw some of the major problems with the Articles that were exposed by the rebellion. But many became frustrated, specifically farmers, vets, merchants that did business between states, and people who were owed money by the Continental Congress who hadn't been paid. All these people were getting upset with the Articles and the lack of power and authority of the national government. So as a result, Congress called all the states to meet in Philadelphia, to send representatives to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. So what was a meeting to revise the Articles became the Constitutional Convention. 12 of the states attended some or all of the meetings. Rhode Island opposed a stronger central government, so they chose not to take part at all. And the deliberations were kept in secret. The only way we know what happened is by James Madison, who took very detailed, very copious notes of the convention in his diary. And there were some controversial plans. They had to find a balance between the large and the small states and the northern and southern states at the time. So the first plan that came out was proposed by Virginia's delegates, and this gave more power to the states. It established a bicameral legislature, and the number of representatives for each state would be based on population. Small states objected. Obviously, Virginia at the time was the most populous state, so it favored big states like Virginia, but opposed smaller states like New Jersey. So New Jersey forwarded its own plan. And this gave more power to the national government and created a unicameral legislature where each state would have an equal number of representatives. So these are the two main early plans, and neither one had enough support to be passed. And in the end, Roger Sherman of Connecticut came up with what's sometimes known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Plan. And it basically combined the two. You had a bicameral legislature, two houses. The lower house, the number of representatives for each state would be determined by population. So that would be the House of Representatives today. And in the upper house, or the Senate, each state had an equal number of representatives, specifically two. The next major controversy was over slavery and how it would be written into the Constitution. For instance, southern states wanted to count all slaves for representation purposes. Now, they didn't want slaves to have rights or vote or anything like that, but they wanted to be able to count their slaves for people so they could have more representatives. And they didn't want to count them for taxation. Northern states obviously objected, and what eventually arose was a 3/5 compromise, which said that all whites plus 3/5 of the slave population of southern states would be counted for both representation and taxation. Native Americans would not be counted at all. So in order to maintain unity between the North and the South, delegates also compromised on slavery and on the slave trade and agreed not to do anything for it for 20 years. So basically they punted on the issue of the slave trade. Another clause called the Fugitive Slave Clause stated that a slave who fled to another state had to be returned to his or her original state. So the North or the South got most of what it wanted, but again, they had the most powerful states at the time. They had the most influential states and the most power in the convention. The new Constitution also set up a complex system of checks and balances to keep any one branch from becoming too powerful. So, for instance, the legislative branch had checks on the judicial branch. It could propose constitutional amendments to overrule judicial decisions. It could also impeach Supreme Court justices. It could check the executive branch by rejecting executive appointments to the cabinet or to the court, by rejecting treaties. Also, the Congress controls funding for presidential initiatives and also has the power, of course, to impeach the president. Finally, if a president vetoed a law, the Congress still had the power to override that veto. Now, as far as the judicial branch, it could check the legislative branch by declaring the laws passed by Congress to be unconstitutional. And really, the Constitution itself never says that. It just says that the Supreme Court has the authority to interpret the law. It's just later in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution to say that it had the power to declare laws unconstitutional. The judicial branch also checked the executive branch by having the same power over executive actions that it does over legislative ones. Finally, executive branch has the power of the veto and could adjourn or call Congress into session in certain situations. And finally, the executive branch obviously appoints judges. Also, the Constitution gave Congress the authority to set up court systems, although it did have some guidelines. For instance, judges were to be independent of the legislative and executive branch, so it created separation of powers. So the president nominates federal judges, the Senate approves them, and judges can't be fired arbitrarily. They can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, but if somebody's appointed to serve as a federal judge, in most cases, that's a lifetime appointment. So in the end, the delegates, even though they were only called to revise the Articles, creates an entire new system of government. Of course, the Constitution begins with the famous words, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union," yada, yada, yada. Basically, it passed. 3 delegates, however, would not sign it without a Bill of Rights. 39 delegates from 12 states signed it, and the Constitutional Convention adjourned on September 7th, 1787. So at that point, it would go through the long process of ratification. It had to get approved by the states to become the force of law. But more or less, the Constitution is going to remain unchanged with the Bill of Rights added later. We'll talk about ratification, the process of ratification in the next video. So thanks for watching. We'll talk to you guys in class. Bye.